Let's learn the secrets to a high-performing board in today's episode of Fundraising Superheroes. Hello, and welcome to Donor Engine's Fundraising Superheroes podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina, and our team here at Donor Engine loves to learn everything about fundraising and keep you updated on the newest trends in philanthropy and nonprofit tech. As a nonprofit software solution, we want to help organizations unlock the true power of their data, allowing them to save hours of time in management and raise more funds effectively and efficiently. Visit us at donorengine.com to learn more and stay updated on the latest in fundraising and philanthropy. We are facing one of the biggest economic downturns since the 2008 market crash, and nonprofits and their boards are working harder than ever. We need high-performing and engaged boards. So how do you make sure your board is working at its best? Mark Buzan is the founder of the Society of Nonprofit Board Directors and a four-time executive director. He's also worked as a nonprofit board director, a founder of Our Executive Director, which is an association management company. He's written 4 books on governance, strategy, and board recruitment, and with close to 2 decades of experience as a director of communications, government relations, marketing, and business development specialist, as well as a consultant to nonprofits and associations. He is more than qualified to give us advice on today's show. I'm thrilled to have him on here today to talk about board communications and how we can really bring out the best in our board. So thank you, Mark, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So how involved should an executive director be in board meetings? Should they have a more hands-on or hands-off approach?
You know, that's an excellent question, Sabrina. Look, this is all, I'm going to express my view and my experience here. I think the best board meetings really are those where the executive director understands understands their role, and that they're there as I like to say, the consigliere, if you will, that trusted advisor, whereas needed, to be able to guide the board in its decisions and its overall strategic decisions. The board exists there largely to be able to watch out for the stakeholders, be the watchdog, but more importantly, to be able to add as that advisory body for the executive director, the CEO, president, however you want to do it. And as a result of that, the executive director really, or we'll just say executive director for all intents and purposes, because they come in all different titles, I believe really has to draw that, be very mindful and aware of themselves, that ultimately, this is not their organization. This is the stakeholders' organization. And as a result of that, you certainly have to be able to present the options. You certainly have to be aware of where they are, but ultimately it is the board that's going to drive things. So what I would often do as a former executive director myself is sometimes, very often I would present, let's say option A, B, or C, for example, and say to the board, okay, you can go down this route, but you should be aware of here are the advantages and disadvantages on each of these, and allow and encourage a full discussion. Sometimes executive directors might want to pipe in a little bit more, and I understand there are going to be some situations where you're going to want to do that, but ultimately, your role, as I view it, is that of to execute on the desires of the board, but also offering up the practical day-to-day advice, if you will, of what their decisions might mean for operations and that.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like there has to be a lot of trust, especially from the executive director's point of view, because I can imagine as somebody who's doing day-to-day and then coming to a board who maybe meets once a month, kind of letting go, trusting their decision could be hard. Is there any advice you have for people who are?
That is such a good question, and that you're right about that trust factor, but it goes so much further than that. It's really having an ability to be able to constantly, and this is my counsel and advice to executive directors, is to constantly remind yourself of what it's like to be in the other person's shoes. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't boards that don't go wrong. They maybe cross the line. That's probably a whole discussion we could have in itself. But for today's purposes, I'm putting that out to executive directors. First, a few things. Mindful. One, it's really hard sometimes when you're in it day to day to remind yourself that this isn't something that they do on a full-time basis. Okay. that means they're not going to be intimately aware of all of the implications and what that might be. And honestly speaking, you don't want them there. And you don't really want them knowing that kind of stuff as well. They care. The best board directors, having spoken with hundreds over the years, are primarily there. They've got this desire to want to be part of something bigger than themselves, to make an impact, to leave a legacy and be part of that. And to be able to see that, you know what, I played my small part in that, in seeing that organization role. And the payment, if you will, for them is a little bit of a personal pat on the back that they give themselves of feeling good on this. Where I think executive directors and the board and the trust factor that you mentioned, I think comes into some trouble, is when either or forgets that perspective of where the other's coming from. So yeah, it's really important to do that. It's a question of expectation management. It's a question of making sure that as an executive director, you're presenting the information that they need to be having wholesome, fully involved discussions about the big, broader issues and their challenges. And in building that trust, I think it's really very much incumbent upon the executive director to make certain that the information that they bring forward is on that high level of top things, like saying crushing big issues, not bringing back every single darn report of everything, a report of every single thing that you did in the last week. You know what? Nice, but as a board director myself, I can tell you, I'm able to read. Send it to me in an email like this. I'm there to talk about the big issues. That would be my piece of advice on that.
Mm-hmm. And that's great advice, because oftentimes it really boils down to that communication. Are you understanding each other? Exactly like you said, like if you're in a meeting, kind of go through the agenda, stick to the main topics, get what you need to get done, and just trust, going back to the whole trust thing, I guess from both sides too, because just as, you know, a nonprofit leader has to trust that their board knows best, the board member also has to take in what the nonprofit leader is telling them, and you know, kind of take that 2 cents. How do leaders help keep their board members engaged and buying in? Oftentimes, I hear a lot of issues that executives have with their board. They didn't buy in for the year, and they don't really know how to approach them, because that can be a little awkward. So how do you recommend they go about doing
this? Is something that I am so personally passionate about. Okay. I'll tell a little bit of a story myself. As it might have been aware, Sabrina, I'm a former executive director myself, 2-time national one, and currently as well on a contract basis. I do it for two national associations as well. And back in the day, earlier in my career, I kind of made that classic mistake. I think a lot of executive directors do, is they simply approach it from, you know, gosh darn it, why don't they know what I do? Why can't they appreciate how hard I work from like this? And I think the average board director, it's not that they don't care. It's just not in their wheelhouse. And that's a really hard thing from a personal perspective to want to accept. It's, what's that old saying you're saying? They like you, but they're not that into you, kind of thing. It's not about you personally. It's where they come from. So that trust factor has to first and foremost understand from your own perspective of what your role is and what you're expected to do, and how you can set them up for success. That's the first thing, like this. Understanding that, one, they don't need to or want to know, or nor should they you don't want them to know the nitty gritty single details of your committee reports of every darn thing that you did, like this. They need to know the big, your board meetings, and you should be working with your board chair as well to be structuring the board, the majority of the board discussion on broad discussion on strategy. Okay? There's a reason why you're the executive director. They've entrusted you with the operations of things. And then occasionally they're going to check in, and then they're doing their due diligence on that. That's the first part. The second part that's really, really important, and this is a personal mission of mine, which led me down frankly, the founding of a Society of Nonprofit Board Directors, was a realization I had a number of years ago. as I like to say, I was fired into success as a former executive director who got, let's just say I got on the wrong side of a disagreement with my board, and I didn't come out on the winning end. After licking my wounds a lot like that, I went and I figured out, I wanted to ask the question, what part in this did I own? And this is my own sincere advice to executive directors like this. I lost track of, frankly, what their perspective was. Mm-hmm. But we also made a huge mistake in a number of these organizations in going forth and attracting the right board directors with the right reasons, the right motivations. But further to that, even more importantly, and I think this is something across all nonprofits, we do a abysmal job at telling people the reasons why they should, why, or encouraging the right people to want to join, what they're going to get out of that personally. And more importantly, even worse yet, we do a horrible job of just simply checking in with board directors and saying, you know what, how's this working out for you? What are you getting out of this? Is this something like this? And let me emphasize really clearly, I'm not talking about monetary compensation. There is more than one way to be compensated in this life. I think the main reason why people do these kinds of things like this is they're looking for a certain degree of self-accomplishment, of feeling good about themselves. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, that should be encouraged. Yet, when we look at the corporate world, all of the talk nowadays from HR professionals is all about the importance of checking in with your employees, making sure that they feel they feel comfortable, that the environment is inclusive. That's fantastic. Yet we do nothing about that on our for volunteers. Nothing. That's just kind of an attitude of almost, we take of an attitude sometimes is it's either an afterthought or they will be happy with what we give them from the opportunity to do this, and they will take it. Well, you know what? That's not going to cut it. It's not going to cut the mustard on this, folks. I think that those are the key elements that we really need to be thinking about. And at least at the Society of Nonprofit Board Directors, what we've been really focused on is at a board level, at a leadership level, of what can we do to create and move that dialogue at the board level so that we have a better relationship with the executive director, but also that the discussions are also much more a higher level and are personally rewarding. You know, I spoke to once to a board director, and I do this quite oftenly. One of these days, maybe I'll be pressed enough to want to do more of a formal research on this. But in my formal research, informal interviews with one, I asked him a little bit in tongue in cheek, why do you do this? Why do you put yourself through this punishment? Like to take time away from your family, your hobbies, your career, your business, to sit around a board table and talk about financials. And after some of the chuckling's done, he says, you know what? I do this because I want to be surrounded by people who are smarter than me. A conversation, if we set conversations up, I think the board for board levels, board members in particular, where it's one that they know that it's going to be, you know what, I'm going to show up and I'm going to be mentally challenged on this. This is going to be mentally stimulating, and I'm going to be part of something bigger like this. That's a big reason, frankly, to be able to attract the best people, and best of all, keep them as well.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. I interviewed Lori, who's this really big volunteer, like specifically with volunteers that are working under the volunteer managers. And she made a good point. When you're getting free help, take the time to not take them for granted and get to know them and get to know what their skill set is and make them feel like their input is valued. And I think, obviously board members, they have more power, but I think that goes back to the executive director and not only getting to know them on a professional level, but maybe on a personal level, going back to what we were talking before, building that relationship, building that trust, and just seeing how that helps with your day-to-day in your organization. Obviously, different organizations, they require different things from their board, but what are some skills that everyone should be looking for in their board member? What qualities make the perfect board member?
Well, that's going to cut across, and it's going to be, there's no real one answer for that at all, Sabrina. The critical thing that, and it's also going to something, it's also something that's going to likely change over time and evolve over time. The critical thing that's really important for the board to be involved in, and that the executive director can gently counsel of what's available. They can't put, there's only so much they can, if they can gently counsel of what can be possible, is that perhaps even just a committee be formed, or at least there be a discussion around this at the board table about what are the competencies we're looking for? What's the characteristics that we're looking for? Okay? That's one critical element, and I think there's a lot of conversation in and around that at the board table of whether that may be, what we need. We need some legal skills. Maybe we need somebody that's a little bit from the stakeholder, from our particular stakeholders, or from the community perspective, or we needed somebody with a finance background. There's really kind of cuts different ways across different organizations. The important thing that really is that conversation has to happen, really sincerely. But I'd go back to my own, there's lots of discussion in and around that on the blogosphere. You can go and have that. I think what's still lacking, though, is that real inward look that boards themselves need to be having about why would somebody want to do this? Mm-hmm. That's hard. I don't think it should be a controversial thing, but I get the sense sometimes that is a bit of a controversial, little outside of the box disruption in the nonprofit world, but where we should be asking ourselves this. It's so necessary because, I firmly believe, taking a page from, Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, The Social Sector, is that amazing things happen when you get the right people on the bus, and then as a result, focus on getting the right people on the right seats in the bus. Stuff starts sorting itself out. So important that we focus primarily, first and foremost, about that discussion about who do we need? What are the gaps for us? And that can be different depending on whether you are really getting your startup, if you're midway through the formation of your organization, maybe you're going through a bit of a decline in a rough patch, you're going through a change, a transition, you're looking for a new CEO, maybe you need somebody on the with an HR background. I wish there really was a one size fits all, but I really do think that's primarily the foundation of it, having an appropriate discussion of that, and just by doing that, you've already set yourself apart from so many others out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a really hard question because obviously, like a very new organization with small staff run by a founder is going to need totally different things than an organization like Sick Kids here in Ontario, yeah, who's like very established, has been going strong for decades now. Which brings up a really good point. Like, what is specific to your organization? What do you need? What kind of specialties do you require to move forward? But going back to the whole idea of a board skill set, how involved should a board be in the day-to-day? I know a lot of people talk about how, they're kind of there for the overarching strategy, but is there a scenario where, they should cross that boundary, and what happens when that boundary gets crossed?
Well, again, I know I sounds like I'm being very evasive, but there's really, in this instance, and this is different than a lot of what you speak out there. My view on this is the big answer is it depends. And let me so we're touching on the fundamental elements of governance, of nonprofit governance here. A lot of people are very prone towards saying that it must be policy governance, and there's a Chinese wall, frankly, between the staff and the board. That's one model, but in my research, frankly, in the book that I've written, this is what I've identified as many as 11 different possible models. Imagine like this. The critical thing isn't choosing what it is you're like this. Oh, there. The critical thing is making it clear amongst everybody about what model you're using and why you're using that. And also regularly checking in and training your board and reminding your executive director and there about the model that we're using, and also having an occasional, maybe whether it's an annual, biannual, whatever discussion with the board, saying, is this model still serving us? And for whatever reasons they are. From what I've witnessed and what I've, there, trouble comes in terms of that relationship that you talk about crossing the line when it's not clear. And the why we use a particular model is not necessarily expressed. The death knell of all nonprofits is we've always done it this way, so this is why. That also is a very critical role of the board itself, and why it's so important as well that you've got a board that's aware of its role, that knows how to stay in its lane, and the reasons for why on this. So you can have very large organizations where it doesn't make a lot of sense. Where you've got a very competent management team that's paid staff with a VP, with several VPs and a CEO and like that. Obviously, that would not be useful in that instance to have the board involved in every kind of thing. And frankly, I think you'd probably, in my instance like that, with organizations like that, you'd turn away a lot of good board members, right? If you're way at the beginning of things, then, well, for a variety of reasons, you're just maybe going to have to do that. But the critical element, again, is really making sure you check in with that above all in this. And I think that it comes down to personally training, and that's a little of why we emphasize that so much at the Society of Nonprofit Board Directors, and also our coming conference as well, the Nonprofit Board Summit, where we're talking about those difficult conversations and getting everybody on board with your board.
Yeah, I never even thought of it like that. I guess there's no rule stating that halfway through the year, if you figured out what wasn't working before, it wasn't working. Why not change those expectations? Why not have that serious conversation and say, listen, I think it's better if you start getting start getting more involved with the day-to-day, because we are struggling here, and here, and that's your skill set. So I think that just as, onboarding is important, having those check-ins, and exactly like we were saying before, kind of like how a business checks in with their employees, checking with your board members and getting their input on whether or not maybe they should, go beyond the strategy and kind of help you with the nitty-gritty of your nonprofit.
Indeed. But further to that, it's also really important that you start codifying, recording those decisions, why that happens, so that you can go back to that, because a lot of trouble can happen down the line. He's saying, for a variety of reasons, maybe we had to surge up to meet a crisis like this, but is that crisis still there? I remember giving governance training to a group of voluntary organizations, their board members, their board chairs from all around where I am in the Ottawa area. And inevitably, what's really kind of interesting is when you ask board directors, are you a micromanager? Oh, no, I'm not. I'm like this. Okay. And you're very policy hands off. Okay. What would happen in the crisis? Would you still view that? Keep your hand. And do you feel yourself that you're out of the weeds in that? Then they would all put their hands up on this. Say, if a crisis were to come about, would that still be your case? Not all hands stayed up. That got people thinking about that. Okay, so it's good. It's really important that those levels of expectations be set out very clearly and discussed openly as well at board meetings about what that is, because that will permeate throughout the culture of the board as well.
Mm-hmm. And COVID really has been the perfect example of that, because I find when I was having conversations, especially back in March at the beginning when it all started, a lot of the question was like, we don't know what to do. We don't have enough information to make those right decisions. And even going back to their boards, going back to the other members of their team, it was a really confusing time. So that was probably a great opportunity for people to step beyond what their normal expectations were. Before we go today, I would love to get your advice for nonprofit leaders on how they can better support their board members.
Yeah, this is really critical. The first thing, like I said, and I go back to the point that I made, is try as much as possible. You're challenging. I have so much sympathy for what you do because I've been there myself. In fact, I think it's the only profession I know of where you get a different boss every year or two. It literally is the only one that I know of that does that. So what comes with that, and you've also got bosses, for example, quote unquote bosses, who don't do this on a full-time basis, or they might not always have necessarily come from the same background or nonprofit experience. Their number one driver for wanting to do this is they've got a passionate desire to want to give back to a cause, a community, the professional of this. So understanding with that passion and working that, you've got to be able to make certain that there are regular opportunities for board members to understand their role, how to make that impact, and also most importantly, how they can kind of internalize what that experience can look like for them as a personal ROI, if that makes sense, a return on their own personal impact in that. The best way of doing that, in all sincerity, is board training. Now, challenge with a lot of board training, unfortunately, is that it's usually focused on one weekend retreat, one weekend retreat, where the board might get together and everybody comes out after a whole weekend, and usually, unfortunately, with 6 months later, it's either forgotten or things have changed and like this. And it can be challenging also for a lot of smaller organizations to be able to get a weekend facilitator or a facilitated retreat in this. And we thought that this was the number one big challenge, frankly, at Society of Nonprofit Board Directors, why so many nonprofits struggle on finance, on program delivery, and like that. You know what? It's not fun. I know this sounds like heresy to fundraisers, but it's not usually about fundraising. It's about leadership and setting our leaders up for right. So that's why we think, frankly, that the best way of learning is actually from your peers, other board directors. And that's why opportunities such as the Society of Nonprofit Board Directors and coming summit, the Nonprofit Board Summit, is so critical. It's one weekend packed with board directors from nonprofits from around the world. We're gathering online. We're going to be covering off all of the different subjects you can imagine about how to be an effective board leader as well. That would be my advice.
Well, thank you again, Mark, for coming onto the show. Mark will be speaking at the Nonprofit Board Summit in 2 weeks. It starts on February 26th, so if you're interested, make sure to get your tickets now. Link is in our description box, or you could visit nonprofitboardsummit.org. I've also linked the book that Mark referenced if you are interested in learning more about the different ways that nonprofits and their boards can work together. And if you want to stay updated on everything Fundraising Superheroes, we would love for you to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Leave a rating if you can, and of course, give us a follow at Donor Engine on Facebook and LinkedIn. There you'll figure out when our guests are, when the newest podcast will be released, and also have a ton of information and resources and everything fundraising and nonprofit. So definitely give us a follow there. We really appreciate you listening to today's show, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So thank you for listening to Fundraising Superheroes.